So far, we have talked about Ivan Pavlov, who was actually not a psychologist, but a biologist. We have also talked about John Watson. We have talked about Edward Thorndike. And now another major founder in the school of behaviorism is B.F. Skinner. And B.F. Skinner went a little bit different direction than classical conditioning, which again dealt with those more naturally occurring reflexive behaviors. Instead, he built on the idea of Thorndike and the fact that we perform behaviors voluntarily in order to get some sort of reward, or we don't do that behavior because of a punishment. So depending on what the consequences, we are either going to be more or less likely to do that behavior. Again, based on that idea of law of effect. So B.F. Skinner took it to a whole new level, kind of looking at the fact that it is only our environment that ultimately determines what our behavior is. B.F. Skinner based his theory on two main concepts, the idea of reinforcement and the idea of punishment. So reinforcement always increases a response. It is the process by which a stimulus or event strengthens or increases the probability of the response that it follows. How many of you have ever gone to an event because something free was being offered? A free t-shirt, a free food, any kind of free pen, sunglasses, whatever it was, you went because you were going to get something from it. So it increases the likelihood that you're going to show up if we offer something free. So we come up with all these ideas. If we give you a t-shirt, if we give you a hamburger, if we give you ice cream, you're going to be more likely to show up because it increases the likelihood of you showing up for the event. Punishment, on the other hand, always weakens a behavior. It always decreases the likelihood that that behavior will occur again. So let's say that you were driving along and you ended up getting a ticket for speeding. That is a form of punishment. And the idea is that you're going to be less likely to speed in the future as a result of your punishment. So reinforcement always increases a behavior. A dog performs the trick, you give the dog a treat, the dog is more likely to do that behavior in the future. However, if the dog performs a trick and you punish the dog and you tell the dog no, the dog is less likely to do that behavior in the future, and that is known as punishment. So reinforcement always strengthens the response, punishment always weakens it. Reinforcement always increases the behavior, and it can do it in one of two ways. It can either do it through positive reinforcement or it can do it through negative reinforcement. Think of positive and negative as plus and minus, not necessarily good and bad. So positive reinforcement, you're increasing your behavior in order to get something that you want. So you go to the event to get free food, or you do something for money, or you do something for a sticker. It's positive reinforcement. It's going to increase the likelihood of the behavior. Negative reinforcement, you still increase your behavior, but you're increasing your behavior to avoid something unpleasant. You pay your water bill on time to avoid getting your water turned off or to avoid having to pay a late fee, but it increases your bill paying on time behavior in order to avoid something unpleasant. In the example given here on the slide, the behavior is studying. If you study because you want to get a good grade, that is positive reinforcement. You're increasing your behavior in order to get something positive. Negative reinforcement, you're still increasing your studying behavior, but now you're increasing it to avoid listening to your mom nag at you about your grades. Either way, you're increasing your behavior, one by adding something to it, the other by avoiding something unpleasant. Positive and negative can also be applied to punishment. So punishment always decreases a behavior, either by adding something unpleasant or by removing something that is pleasant. So let's go back to the example of getting a speeding ticket. So getting a speeding ticket is punishment for speeding. So positive punishment is you are getting a speeding ticket, and so that's going to decrease your behavior because of the fine that you're going to have to pay. Whereas negative punishment is you are decreasing your behavior to avoid getting your license taken away. Either way, you're decreasing your behavior because it is punishment, one by having something added, other by having something or avoiding something unpleasant. So we're going to look in this section on some of the principles that are working in operant conditioning. And remember, operant conditioning deals with what kind of behaviors? Voluntary. So Thorndike had his puzzle boxes that he put cats in. B.F. Skinner had what is called the Skinner box, and Skinner was known for using pigeons and rats. So the photograph here on the left is an actual photograph of B.F. Skinner working on operant conditioning, reinforcing a rat in one of his Skinner boxes. So the way that it would work is when the rat who was in the Skinner box pressed the lever, a food pellet would be released, and so the rat would get reinforcement and then would be more likely to do that behavior in the future. Operant conditioning has some of the same associations as classical conditioning in that there is extinction, stimulus generalization, as well as stimulus discrimination. So in extinction, if that rat who's in the Skinner box keeps pushing that lever and never gets any food, eventually the rat's going to quit pushing the lever because it's not giving him anything. So if you remove the reinforcement, then eventually that learned response will go away, and we call that extinction. Stimulus generalization and operant conditioning, the idea is if it is a similar type stimulus, then I am likely to have the same response. So it doesn't matter whether you're giving me a free hamburger or a free ice cream cone or a free Dr. Pepper, I am going to be likely to respond, and you are more likely to get me to come to your event if you give me something free, especially if it's food. Now, in stimulus discrimination, I may only show up to your meeting if you actually give me a free t-shirt. So, and it's got to be a blue t-shirt, and it's got to be soft, and it's got to be exactly the right size. So in stimulus discrimination, I respond only to the stimulus that is going to give me what I want. I'm not going to respond to any other stimulus. B.F. Skinner also found that the schedule of reinforcement had an impact on the rate of the behavior. So there is partial reinforcement, also known as intermittent reinforcement, or continuous reinforcement. So partial reinforcement, you only get reinforced sometimes. You only get the food pellet sometimes when you push the lever. Sometimes you get it, sometimes you don't. Partial reinforcement makes it very difficult for a behavior to become extinguished because you never know if I push the lever, am I actually going to get a treat this time or am I not? Partial reinforcement is one of the reasons why gambling is so addictive. Am I going to win this time or am I not? I mean, we find that with the games on our phone, right? I'm just going to play one more time. I'm just going to play one more time. Maybe I'll just play one more time because you keep thinking maybe this time I'll win. And sometimes you do, and sometimes you don't. That is partial reinforcement. It makes it very resistant to extinction. Now, continuous reinforcement is when I reinforce the behavior every single time it happens. Continuous reinforcement is very effective for a behavior that doesn't happen very often. So if you're trying to teach your dog a new trick, every time the dog does the behavior, you're going to give the dog a treat because it doesn't happen very often, and so you want to reinforce that behavior every single time it does happen. Shaping involves reinforcing successive approximations to your desired behavior. This is especially effective when you are training animals. So you don't just expect the dolphins to jump 20 feet in the air through the hoop. Instead, you start off just reinforcing the dolphin for swimming over the hoop that's laying on the bottom of the pool. And then you turn the hoop up on end, and every time the dolphin swims through the hoop, you give the dolphin a fish. And then you raise the hoop gradually. And every time you raise the hoop a little bit, you give the dolphin a fish. You are shaping and reinforcing successive approximations to your ultimate goal, which is to get that hoop out of the water and 20, 30, 40 feet in the air, and the dolphin jumps through it, and you give the dolphin a fish. So shaping is you reinforce those successive approximations until you ultimately get to your desired behavior. So we're going to take a look at how operant conditioning can work in real life. When we apply operant conditioning techniques to various behaviors to either increase a response or decrease a response or even eliminate a response, we refer to that as behavior modification. So, modifying the behavior. And behavior modification can be very effective in lots of different settings, not just to teach your dog new tricks, but you can have behavior modification in schools, in hospitals, in prison settings, anywhere where you want to either encourage positive behavior or you want to reduce or eliminate problem behavior. Sometimes we even use it on our spouses, on our boyfriends and girlfriends, on our children. There are lots of different areas that you can use behavior modification. So, we've been talking a lot about reinforcement and how reinforcement always increases a behavior. And there's lots of different ways that you can use reinforcement. You can provide stickers, you can provide money, you can provide free t shirts or free food. But now we're going to take a look at punishment. And does punishment work? Can it be effective? Sometimes punishment is effective. So, for instance, my son in a 6 month period got 3 speeding tickets. Well, the accumulation of those fines and punishments that he received from various DPS and county officials actually worked to decrease his speeding behavior. So sometimes punishment can be effective. Now, the severity of the punishment you have to be careful with. Um, Sometimes, in some situations, very severe punishment can actually backfire and can actually cause the person to act out in other ways. But sometimes the severity can make a difference. So let's say that, for instance, I were to tell you that now in the city of Houston, they have decided that if you run a red light, it's only going to cost you $5. That's not true, but let's just say that it was. Well, if it was only going to cost you $5 if you ran a red light, what are the chances that you're not going to run the red light? Probably pretty slim. However, if I told you that running a red light is going to cost you $5,000, it might actually cause you to stop when that light turns yellow. So, severity sometimes makes a difference, but not always, and especially if you start talking about abusive type situations. But with punishment, the thing that's most important is consistency. If you sometimes get in trouble and sometimes don't, if you sometimes get a speeding ticket and you sometimes don't, sometimes that can make it very difficult for punishment to work. So, for punishment to be most effective, consistency is what matters most. If you knew that every single time you ran a red light, you were going to get a $5,000 ticket, it might actually change your driving behavior. So, when does punishment fail? Punishment fails if it is not administered appropriately or if it's just done mindlessly. If you aren't doing it with intention of decreasing the behavior, with an understanding of severity and understanding of consistency, if you're just basically lashing out, then punishment doesn't work. If the recipient of the punishment responds with anxiety, fear, or anger, then the punishment is not going to be effective. If instead it causes them to get angry, then that's not going to be very effective at decreasing the behavior. Sometimes the effect is temporary. How many of you got in trouble for maybe hitting a sibling or doing something else, and as soon as mom left the room, you started right back up? So sometimes punishment only works if the punisher is there. We oftentimes speed on the highway if we don't see a police officer. And so the effect of the punishment is only good if we actually see a police officer. If the punishment doesn't immediately follow the behavior, then that's not very effective. If you try to scold your dog at 5 o'clock in the afternoon when you got home and your dog got into the trash at 9 o'clock that morning, the dog's not necessarily going to make that connection between the dog's behavior and your anger. Now, the dog might feel really sad and be really upset that you're mad at them, but they don't necessarily make the connection. And the other problem with punishment decreases a behavior, but it doesn't teach you anything. All it does is tell you what not to do. It doesn't tell you what you should do. So it doesn't tell you necessarily how to avoid future punishment. And punishment can sometimes be reinforcing because sometimes punishment brings attention, and sometimes that's why we do certain behaviors is to get attention. So even if the attention is negative, we still might continue the behavior because at least we're getting the attention. So some good alternatives to punishment: teach children problem-solving skills. Help them to understand what they need to do in the situation and how they might be able to handle the situation differently. Help to reward good behavior. So again, when you do punishment, punishment decreases a behavior and causes a void. Now what do? I know I'm not supposed to do that, but what am I supposed to do instead? So if we can teach a good behavior by rewarding that, then that can fill the void. So ideally, you want to be able to extinguish a behavior. If you want a behavior to go away, then ignore the behavior. So by a use of both extinction, ignoring the bad behaviors, and reinforcement, encouraging and increasing the positive behaviors, you can actually help to change behaviors much more effective than punishment. So there are problems with punishment, but sometimes there can be problems with reward. Sometimes we misuse rewards. Sometimes we provide rewards when rewards may not need to be provided. And in fact, sometimes we provide a reward and the person thinks, well, this must not be a really awesome thing if she's having to reward me to get me to do it. So if she's having to pay me to get good grades, then it may not be worth it to really work for grades. And if I'm not going to get paid, then maybe I won't even work for them. So sometimes we can misuse rewards. I had a friend who she did not believe in paying her children for doing chores. Doing chores was part of being a member of the family. Everybody has to work to make a family work. And so participating in chores is just one thing that you need to do as part of this family. And so providing money for that gives the wrong message. Self-esteem also, the self-esteem approach, if we want to make you feel better by giving you stickers, by giving you rewards, then that might actually be a little bit misguided, and people might again wonder, why do you have to give me these rewards for something that maybe I should be doing anyway? And then another problem is grade inflation. The idea of grade inflation is that you are getting a better grade than maybe you actually deserve.
I know the high school that my children went to, you never got below a 50. Teachers were not allowed to give a grade below a 50. So even if you didn't turn something in, you still got a 50 instead of a 0. Well, a 0 has a much bigger impact on your grade than a 50 does. And so you then don't have the consequences of actually not turning in your work. And so then when you go to college and professors don't do that, that can actually be a very difficult learning situation. So there are extrinsic reinforcers and there are intrinsic reinforcers. Extrinsic reinforcers are external reinforcers. So things like stickers and money and free food and t-shirts, those are all external reinforcers. So you do the behavior in order to get some sort of tangible reward. Intrinsic reinforcers are internal reinforcers. You do it because you want to do it. You do it because you love the person. You do it for internal reasons, not for some sort of tangible reward. So, external reinforcers can sometimes reduce the intrinsic pleasure that you have for the activity. If you're only doing it to get the actual reward, then it takes away from the pleasure of actually doing the behavior. So researchers in the study that you see here, the graph shows the results of the study. Researchers gave these children some felt tip pens to draw with. And the kids were having a great time with the felt tip pens, really enjoying playing with them. And then the researchers told some of the children, the ones in the green group, that if they drew with the felt tip pens, they would get a prize. Now, when the preschoolers were promised a prize for drawing, you can see on the left-hand side that they actually drew a little bit more than the group that was not promised any kind of reward. But then after the experiment, after they had received their prize, they continued to measure and see if the kids continued playing with the felt tip markers. And what they found was the kids that received a prize for playing with the felt tip markers were less likely to continue playing with them than the kids that didn't receive any reward. So even though they'd been really having a lot of fun with it, when they were no longer going to get a prize for doing it, they were no longer interested in doing it, as opposed to the group that was just doing it because it was fun. So far, we've looked at behavior and whether you have learned something or not based on your behavior, measuring if you increase your behavior or decrease your behavior, or if you learn through an association, we can observe it and we can measure it, and then we know that you've learned it. But sometimes learning isn't necessarily something you can measure. Sometimes learning happens in your brain, sometimes learning happens cognitively, and it's not always so easy to measure. So, latent learning is the idea that sometimes we learn things, but unless we are motivated to demonstrate that learning, we don't necessarily show that we've learned the information. So, think about the fact of like when you first got your driver's license and it was the first time for you to drive somewhere in the car all by yourself. Nobody was with you to tell you where to go, and let's just even pretend you didn't have your phone with you to tell you where to go. And so there might have been a little uncertainty. Do I really know how to get to school? Do I really know how to get to the store? I mean, I think I do. I've been there many times, but until you are have to demonstrate that you have learned it, we don't necessarily know where you've learned whether you've learned it or not. Similarly to a test, I can see whether you're watching the videos and you're watching the PowerPoints and you're doing the activities that are online. But unless I give you a test, I don't necessarily know whether you've actually learned the material or not. So Edward Tolman did a classic experiment looking at latent learning. So he had three groups of rats. One group of rat was put in the maze, and when they ran the maze, every single time they got to the end of the maze, they got a prize. The second and third groups of rats ran the maze, but when they got to the end of the maze, there was no prize for them. And so, as you can see, the blue group, which is the group that got a prize every single time they ran the maze, they got progressively faster every day. The red and orange groups, group 2 and 3, when they got to the end of the maze, there wasn't a prize for them. And you can see they got a little bit faster, but you didn't really see a difference until day 11. On day 11, the red group, there was suddenly a treat at the end of the maze when the rat got there. And look at how much faster the red group got. The red group actually got faster than the group that had been receiving a prize every single time they got to the end of the maze. And so, what Edward Tolman said was based on this experiment, it showed that the rats had learned the maze. All three groups had learned the maze. But until the red group was motivated to demonstrate that learning, you didn't necessarily know whether the rats had learned the maze or not. Latent learning. Whereas Tolman focused on the cognitive aspects of latent learning, we can also learn things through social cognitive interactions, through watching other people. Any of you ever slow down when you see that somebody has been pulled over on the side of the road? Now, you don't necessarily know that they've been pulled over for speeding. Sometimes we make that assumption, we make that expectation, we have that belief. But sometimes we do it just as a way of seeing somebody else get in trouble causes us to then change our behavior. Maybe you even watched your sibling get in trouble for something and you determined you were never going to do that because you didn't want to experience the same consequences. Or reverse, you may have seen somebody get something for something and you decided, hey, maybe I'm going to do that too. There's positive consequences of that. So, in social cognitive theory, sometimes we learn just by observing and imitating other people. So, observational learning is the process in which a person learns a new behavior by observing the behavior of another person, often called the model, rather than through a direct experience. Have you ever learned something by watching a YouTube video? I know I have. We've spent lots of times, we do home improvement projects, and so, you Google it or you find a YouTube video to figure out how to fix the kitchen sink or even how to tie a tie. And so we sometimes learn by observing other people, and it doesn't even require us to actually perform the behavior. We can just learn by observing. The classic experiment that was done by Albert Bandura showed the impact of observational learning. So, what he did was he took some children and he put them in the room and he let them play with what's called a Bobo doll. Do you remember those dolls when you were a kid? They had it was like a punching bag doll. It was about 3 feet tall. It had sand in the bottom. You blew it up, and when you punched it, it fell over and then it came right back up. So he observed the children in the room playing with the Bobo doll, and then he had them leave the room and observe an adult playing with the Bobo doll in a very violent, very aggressive manner, throwing, hitting, punching very aggressively. And then he had the children go back in the room and observed if they had changed their behavior after observing someone acting very aggressively towards the Bobo doll. And what he found was that their aggression increased and increased significantly. And actually, they got even more aggressive than the model that they had observed. So, what Bandura found was that we do learn by observing other people. And sometimes that can be aggressive behavior as well. So the question that came from Bandura's research was, does media violent then make you violent? It used to be believed that watching violence helped to purge or helped you release violent behaviors. But what Bandura's research shows is that sometimes watching violence can actually increase the violent behavior. Now the research that he did was with 3 to 5 year olds, And he did see an increase in violence from watching violence on TV. And so, and that can be violence in TV, violence in movies, violence in video games. And so there's a lot of things that that are important to take into account. One of them is how many hours is the child spending watching videos or watching movies or watching violent TV shows, because that can impact. It may not be the number of hours specifically, but it may be the fact that the child isn't doing anything else. The child isn't interacting in other social situations. Instead, the child is just being immersed in a violent situation. Age of the child has a big difference too. Younger children have a much more difficult time determining what is real and what is fiction. And so it can be difficult for them to make that distinction. And so, watching violence, they may perceive it as being real, not necessarily artificial, like you have in some video games. And then you've also got to take into account a similar idea, are there any mental issues that the person might be dealing with? So, even though they might be older, if they have some mental health issues, they may also not be perceiving the violence in the same way that someone who is not struggling with any kind of mental illness might be perceiving the behavior. So, there's lots of studies that have been out there, and the idea is to just be sensitive to the fact that violence can cause violence in some people. And so it's important to be aware of that, monitor the number of hours that you spend on that, find other socially acceptable outlets for your behavior, and just, kind of be aware of what the research says.